I'm so excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Ray Dorsey. He is the David M. Levy Professor of Neurology at the University of Rochester and is working to identify and eliminate the root causes of Parkinson's disease. His research on brain diseases and digital health has been published in leading academic journals and featured in multiple news outlets. In 2020, Ray and his colleagues wrote Ending Parkinson's Disease, a book that provides a prescription for ending the world's fastest growing brain disease. Dr. Dorsey previously directed the Movement Disorders Division in Neurology Telemedicine at Johns Hopkins and worked as a consultant for McKinsey & Company. In 2015, the White House recognized him as a champion for change for Parkinson's disease. He is a knowledgeable advocator and educator, and we are so lucky to have him with us today. Please give a giant welcome to our opening speaker, Dr. Ray Dorsey.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jody, for that kind introduction. Thank you very much to the Parkinson's Association of the Rockies for organizing such a wonderful event, and thank you to the sponsors for helping support it. I'm going to tell you that Parkinson's disease, one of the world's fastest growing brain diseases, is preventable. Parkinson's disease is a preventable disease. And why does that matter? I'll give you 3 reasons. First, if you have Parkinson's disease, you probably want to know how to slow the rate of progression. If you knew what was causing the disease, you'd probably want to avoid those environmental factors so that you could slow it. Just like if you were a smoker and you had lung cancer, what's the first thing the doctor's going to tell you to do? Stop smoking. But when you were told that you had Parkinson's disease, did anyone tell you to stop getting exposed to the chemicals that might have been causing your disease in the first place? Second, many of you are looking for better treatments or a cure. I submit to you that you can't cure a disease medically until you know its cause. You can't cure a disease medically until you know its cause. I'll give you an example. How many of you remember stomach ulcers? You remember stomach ulcers? Yeah. What do they think stomach ulcers were due to? Stress. What did they tell you to do? Quit your job, get less stressful. They even did radical surgeries. Did any of that work? No. What causes stomach ulcers? Bacteria. So these 2 scientists, doctors, were saying this is what causes stomach ulcers. It's bacteria. They were ridiculed, discredited, until one of them actually swallowed a solution of the bacteria and gave himself the stomach ulcers, and then he took an antibiotic, and then he was cured. Third reason that you should care about that Parkinson's is preventable is you probably don't want your kids or future generations to get the disease. So that's why we're going to talk to you about why Parkinson's is preventable. So central thesis is that Parkinson's is a man-made disease. Before Dr. Parkinson described it in 1817 in London, it was extraordinarily rare. Second, that Parkinson's is rising and preventable. And third, that we can create, and I would indeed say we have an obligation to create a world without Parkinson's disease. So in 1962, Rachel Carson launched the environmental movement with her book, Silent Spring. And she didn't argue against the use of pesticides, which, like DDT, were instrumental in preventing millions of people from getting malaria during World War II. She argued against the indiscriminate and widespread use of pesticides. And she was concerned that the widespread use of pesticides would lead to new diseases. And this is what she wrote. The farmers spoke of much illness among their families. In the town, the doctor had become more and more puzzled by new kinds of sickness appearing among their patients. Now, she wasn't necessarily thinking of Parkinson's disease unless she was really brilliant, but I think she was exactly right. And that these chemicals are fueling the rise of Parkinson's. Now, many of you have been told that Parkinson's disease is due to genetics. I'll ask you, how many of you carry a genetic cause for Parkinson's disease? How many of you do not carry a genetic cause for Parkinson's disease? So Parkinson's disease turns out to be among the least heritable of all major medical conditions. Parkinson's disease is among the least heritable of all major medical conditions. It's not my opinion. This is from a paper in Nature Review Genetics, which looks at the heritability of diseases, and some diseases are really, really heritable. I spent 10 years caring for people with Huntington's disease. I don't think I said the word environment once because Huntington's disease is due to a single genetic mutation that's passed on from generation to generation. And other diseases like type 1 diabetes, schizophrenia, have a high heritability. They run commonly in families. But only about 15% of people with Parkinson's disease have a family history of the disease. We've known this for 100 years. And we know that only about 15% of people carry a genetic risk factor for the disease. And Parkinson's disease, you can see, is among the least heritable diseases. So if it's not genetics, then it's the environment. And so what are the three major causes of Parkinson's disease in the environment in the United States? And I think it varies by region. I think it's one, certain pesticides, including a pesticide called paraquat. Second one is a dry cleaning chemical called trichloroethylene. How many people have heard of trichloroethylene? All right, wow, good. All right, I think it's the most important cause of Parkinson's disease in the United States, and I'm going to tell you why. And then third is outdoor air pollution. I'll start with paraquat. So I was speaking to a fellow neurologist before we were speaking today, and he said in 1986 he was a medical student and he was investigating the environmental causes of Parkinson's disease, writing a review, because in 1983 a contaminant in a street form of heroin called MPTP was causing Parkinson's, not in older individuals, but in young individuals, and not happening over many months or years, but happening acutely. And that chemical called MPTP bears a striking resemblance to the pesticide paraquat. If you look at their chemical structures, they're nearly identical. Dr. Kimberly Paul is going to tell you a lot more about the dangers of paraquat today. But it's considered the most toxic weed killer ever created. It kills the weeds that Roundup doesn't. It's been used to commit homicide and suicide. It's associated with a 150% increased risk of Parkinson's disease, 150% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. It's so toxic that China and over 50 other countries have banned it, but the United States has not. In fact, it's sprayed on corn, cotton, and vineyards probably today, probably a little bit in Colorado, certainly in upstate New York where I live, and certainly in Los Angeles where Dr. Paul lives. And it turns out that lots of research Dr. Paul is going to describe to you has linked paraquat in human studies and in animal studies. One of my colleagues, Dr. Debbie Cora-Schlechter, did research in the 1990s showing that when you feed paraquat to laboratory animals, they develop both the clinical features, they develop slow movements, and pathological features of the disease. When you look at their brain, they look like they have Parkinson's. It turns out that all of this information is dwarfed by what the manufacturer knew about its own product. At least according to the reporting from The Guardian, they looked at legal documents that the chemical company has submitted in lawsuits because many farmers, especially from California, have sued the company because they used paraquat and then developed Parkinson's disease. And Ms. Carrie Gilliam and her colleagues reviewed this literature and showed some disturbing findings. If you were exposed to pesticides, you should read this. Just Google Guardian and paraquat. And it turns out that for over 50 years, the chemical company knew about the dangers of its own product. In the 1960s, they fed paraquat to mice, to rats, and to rabbits, and they all developed the clinical features of Parkinson's disease, including tremor. So the company knew for 30 years before academic scientists that their product, when exposed to animals in their own settings, produced the clinical features of Parkinson's disease. All this was conducted before I was born. In the 1968, poisoning deaths and suicides due to paraquat rose. In 1974, regulators were concerned that workers, quote, might inadvertently lick small quantities of paraquat residue off their lips or inhale paraquat mist. Rumors circulate that some in the EPA were favoring banning of paraquat. 50 years later, they have yet to do so. In 1976, 4 years after I was born, a brain autopsy from a farm worker showed degenerative changes in the cells of the substantia nigra, which many of you know is exactly what you see in Parkinson's disease. In 1985, Andre Barbeau, a neurologist, Canadian neurologist, looked at the rates of Parkinson's disease in rural parts of Canada and pesticide use. And he found a near perfect correlation between the amount of pesticide use in different rural parts of Canada and rates of Parkinson's disease. Correlation is measured on a scale that goes from 0 to 1, and he found a 0.967 correlation. The company was really concerned about this study. They warned that paraquat could become a huge legal liability like asbestos, and said that Parkinson's could go on for decades. And I think they were right. So I sent this article to my friend who's an English professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and he goes, "Ray, this is agnotology." And probably like many, if not all of you, I was like, what in the world is agnotology? Well, he goes, "Ray, science is the production of knowledge, ideally for the public's good. Agnotology is the deliberate production of ignorance, often for commercial gain." And this is not a new tactic. This was widely used in the tobacco industry, who even had a term for it, a slogan internally, which was "Doubt is our product." We're not trying to show you that smoking is good for you, although they used to do that with ads depicting doctors smoking cigarettes. They would just say, "We're not sure, we need more evidence, it's not been proven." And that same thing has been applied to the opioid pandemic. It's being applied to social media companies, as many of you have read. And if it's being applied to paraquat and Parkinson's disease, we should be asking to what other chemicals is it being applied to related to Parkinson's disease, and for what other conditions. Which brings me to trichloroethylene. So trichloroethylene is a really, really simple molecule. Many of you know that water, H2O, is made up of 3 atoms. Trichloroethylene is made up of a whopping 6. I carry it with me everywhere I go. 2 carbon atoms in black, 1 hydrogen atom in white, and then 3 chlorine atoms in blue, hence its name, trichloroethylene. It's got a cousin that has probably very similar, if not the same toxicity with respect to Parkinson's disease. It's called perchloroethylene. Instead of having 3 chlorine atoms, it has 4 chlorine atoms. Perchloroethylene is widely used in dry cleaning. It's probably used in dry cleaners, was most common used dry cleaner in the United States. I'll tell you right now, I would avoid dry cleaning, and I would not use a dry cleaner that uses perchloroethylene. There are green dry cleaners that usually have a green leaf that use different chemicals. Now, these chemicals were widely used in commercial products and industrial products and in the military. In the 1970s, 600 million pounds of TCE, 2 pounds per American, were produced. It was in typewriter correction fluid. It was in your decaffeinated coffee. It was in your carpet cleaner. It was in your gun cleaner. Over 10 million Americans worked with TCE, and if you worked in aircraft jet engine mechanic, if you were a computer specialist, if you worked in Silicon Valley, if you cleaned off silicon wafers, if you were an embalmer, if you were an oil processor, if you were a painter or a printer, if you were a shoemaker or a taxidermist, a weapons specialist, or a varnish worker, you quite possibly could have been exposed to trichloroethylene. It also has a wide range of commercial uses and industry uses. It was so widely used that doctors even used it as an anesthetic agent for pregnant women. This is from Dr. Charles Flowers writing in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology in 1956, and he said, and I quote, "Trilene or trichloroethylene is a potent analgesic drug. Its margin of safety and ease of administration will ultimately make it a standard agent on all delivery floors. Trilene's wide variety of uses will probably allow almost every obstetrician to find a place for it in his obstetrical practice." It was even used that people could self-administer it. Midwives could do it. You could hold the canister yourself and give it to yourself until you would pass out. If any of you used it, I would love to hear your story. There's even some suggestion, although no one's looked at the acute effects on pregnant women, the chronic effects of TC is associated with miscarriages, low birth weight babies, congenital heart disease, and a wide range of other congenital abnormalities. And there's one study that suggested that anesthesiologists might have had increased rates of Parkinson's disease themselves. TC is associated with a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's disease, a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. Almost nothing in science is associated with that. This is from a small twin study done by my colleagues, Dr. Caroline Tanner and Sam Goldman, now at University of California, San Francisco. They asked twins from World War II if they had hobby or occupational exposure to TCE, and then looked and see who had Parkinson's disease. Those who had hobby or occupational exposure to the chemical had a 500% six-fold increased risk of developing Parkinson's. Like smoking cigarettes, you don't get exposed to the chemical and develop the disease the next day. The lag time between the exposure and the diagnosis in this study was somewhere between 10 to 40 years, which makes it really, really, really difficult to prove that something that you were exposed to in the past is causing a disease many years later. So when you do find that association, you better sit up and pay attention, because you can imagine the science of doing that is difficult. They said because of the widespread use that the potential public health implications are substantial. Now, if you don't care about Parkinson's disease, you should care about cancer. TCE is known to cause cancer. It's not my opinion. It's the opinion of the World Health Organization, the opinion of the Department of Health and Human Services, and the opinion of the Environmental Protection Agency, which says it's carcinogenic in humans by all routes of exposure. Many cancers are linked to it: non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, prostate cancer, multiple myeloma, renal cancer, and kids' leukemia, and I also think brain cancer. As many of you know, rates of cancer in the United States among Americans for people under 50 are rising. Cancer rates among Americans under 50 is rising, and people don't know why. Clearly it can't be aging because it's under 50. It's not really screening, because most cancer screening is not done to 50. I think, therefore, it's the environment, and this is all happening in the setting of declining smoking rates. So you have cancer rates going up under 50 and smoking rates going down. It begs the question of what's causing these cancers. As many of you know, trichloroethylene contaminated Camp Lejeune. How many of you know about Camp Lejeune? Yes. So Camp Lejeune is a Marine base in North Carolina, was contaminated with trichloroethylene in its drinking water from 1953 to 1987. For the latter years, the Marine Corps knew about the contamination and did nothing. The Marine Corps knew about the contamination, knowingly exposing the best and brightest of Americans to cancer-causing chemicals in their drinking water, and did nothing. They even refused to notify the Marines who served there of the exposure after the fact, until Congress passed a law forcing them to do so. Again, think about agnotology, the deliberate production of ignorance. So Dr. Sam Goldman and Caroline Tanner at UCSF investigated this cohort of Marines who served at Camp Lejeune and compared them to Marines and other service members who served at a less polluted base called Camp Pendleton in California. And they found that the Marines who served at Camp Lejeune had a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease, a 70% increased risk. Now, the Marines who were exposed were by definition healthy. They were young, they were only 20 years old, and they're only there for a short period of time. Those of you who have served, thank you. Know that you're only at a base for a short period of time, in this case, just over 2 years. Yet 34 years later, a 70% increased risk of Parkinson's, and this cohort is still young. The average age is just under 60. So you say to yourself, well, I wasn't a Marine at Camp Lejeune, I wasn't a painter, a printer, or an embalmer. TCE could not have affected me, and to that I would say, unfortunately, you're wrong. Because up to 30% of groundwater in the United States is contaminated with trichloroethylene. Sometimes it's an honest leak from a tank or an underground sewer line. Sometimes companies, dry cleaners, just dump the chemical into the ground, and it percolates through the soil and then gets into the groundwater, which is 15 to 50 feet below the surface, depending on where you live. Once it gets into the groundwater, it forms a concentrated pocket called a plume that can then migrate with the groundwater and travel a mile or more. And because TCE is readily volatile, remember it was used as an anesthetic agent, it, like radon, can evaporate from the soil and water and enter people's homes, schools, and workplaces undetected. And these plumes are everywhere. If you lived on Long Island, you were possibly exposed to one of the largest known plumes in the United States. This is from a military contractor that was using trichloroethylene to degrease the metal. The plume on Long Island in the Bethpage area is a significant threat to the public health or the environment, and continues to move south about 1 mile per day. If you live, work, or your children go to a school in a school or house that's above that plume, you could be having TCE be evaporating into your home and not even know it. It's not just a problem in Long Island, it's a problem in Denver. So this is Lowry Air Force Base. Anyone know about Lowry Air Force Base? So everyone knows about Lowry Air Force Base. You guys are well-educated, well-read. And evidently, Lowry Air Force Base used TCE to clean airplane engines, which formed an underground plume emanating from the base. You can see the picture of the plume from the Denver Post. Concentrations are at 200 to 300 parts per billion, which is 40 times what the state of Colorado deems to be safe. So there are cancer-causing chemicals in this plume at levels that are 40 times that deemed to be safe. At least 15 homes have been reported to have TCE in their indoor air, and it's also at the former Stapleton Airport. You don't need to be in Long Island, you don't need to be in Denver. You can be in Rochester, New York, where I live, and this is a suburban location that I used to drive past almost every day. It's 5 to 10 minutes from my home. It's a nice-looking office park right near Pittsford Wegmans, if you guys know Rochester's home to the Wegmans grocery store. And it turned out there used to be a metal plating facility from 1956 to 1979 that operated there. It was then bought by another business which was looking to do some expansion. As part of that, they had to do environmental inspections. Unbeknownst to them, they found that there was TCE in the groundwater in the soil. They found the concentrations at 130,000 parts per billion. I told you that in Denver, maybe I'll go back, try. In Denver, it was 200 to 300 parts per billion. In Rochester, New York, it's 130,000. This is even more contaminated than Camp Lejeune, at least according to the records that I've seen. So we have in suburban Rochester, New York, a site that's more contaminated than Camp Lejeune. It turned out that the indoor air in this building was tested in 2013, 50 years after the metal fabrication plant had become operational, and they found TCE throughout the building. And the nice thing is that you can readily remediate this by just putting essentially a radon remediation system that sucks the air from underneath the foundation of a home or building and then vents it above, and the indoor air in the building is currently safe. Finally, air pollution. So what was Dr. Parkinson describing in 1817? Well, he said, I'm describing something new, something that has not been described in the medical literature, something that's not been classified in it. And synthetic man-made pesticides weren't really created until World War II. As I mentioned, there are natural occurring pesticides that are linked to the disease. And trichloroethylene, although created in 1864, wasn't widely used commercially until 1920. So what was Dr. Parkinson, what was causing the Parkinson disease in the people that he was watching walking the streets of London? I think it might have been air pollution. Many of you know that when you see smog in Los Angeles or in Denver, you're seeing little pieces of dirt and soot in the air. And those little pieces of dirt and soot, most of them we cough out or sneeze out. But some are so small, 1/30th the width of my hair, that they can be inhaled, pass through the nerve responsible for smell, and go back to the smell centers of our brain. And from there, those little pieces of particulate matter are often carrying hitchhikers. And these hitchhikers are often toxic metals, lead from leaded gasoline, iron from brakes, platinum from catalytic converters that we know are toxic to brain cells. And if you think about Parkinson's disease, many of you know that the pathology of the disease and the vast majority of people begins in the smell center of the brain, and many of you know one of the earliest features of Parkinson's disease is loss of smell. A recent study by our colleagues in neurology from just last year showed that high levels of air pollution are associated with high rates of Parkinson's disease in the United States. In red, you can see high areas of the country that have high levels of air pollution and high levels of Parkinson's disease. And in blue, Colorado being among them, low rates of Parkinson's disease and low levels of air pollution. It turns out that these chemicals, which are either inhaled or ingested, could very well fit in with a new model of the disease by Dr. Per Borghammer and his colleagues, suggesting that Parkinson's disease either has a body-first form, in which it begins in the gut, and then the misfolded protein then spreads up a nerve called the vagus nerve, and then up through ascending upwards, causing first constipation, sleep disturbances, then Parkinsonism, slowed movements, and then dementia. Or it could begin with inhalation of a toxicant like paraquat, like trichloroethylene, and give pathology beginning in the smell centers of our brain, usually on one side, and then spreading back toward the substantia nigra, and then later spreading down the brainstem, and later spreading into both hemispheres. And so this is a model of how these toxins might be contributing to Parkinson's. So Parkinson's is rising. I don't need to tell this audience that Parkinson's is one of the fastest growing brain diseases in the world. 200 years after Dr. Parkinson described 6 people with the disease, the global burden of disease estimated that 6 million had the disease. So you go from 6 to 6 million in 200 years. It can't be genetics. It's unlikely to be longevity alone. It's got to be environment. Indeed, rates of Parkinson's are highest in the industrialized world, like the US and Canada, lowest in the least industrialized worlds like sub-Saharan Africa, and growing most rapidly in countries undergoing rapid industrialization like China and India. There are some great silver linings to this. There's only one high-quality study that I've seen that's shown that the rate of Parkinson's is going down. And that was in this city called Rotterdam in the Netherlands, a port city in the Netherlands, in which they found between 1990 and 2011 a 60% decrease in the number of new cases of Parkinson's. They didn't know why. So I went backwards and looked at my 3 favorite or least favorite environmental causes of the disease and found substantial reductions in all 3 of these. This is not the way you do science. Ideally, you follow reductions and then see what happens in the future, but this is what I had. Turned out that levels of pesticides, including DDT and many pesticides that dissolve in the fat, dropped in human fatty tissue between 75 and 90% in the decades before this decline. Turned out that TCE levels in 1981 in the Netherlands were the lowest in all of Europe. And it turned out that air pollution in the Netherlands had dropped between 50 to 90% in the decades before that. And then you find a 60% decrease in the number of new cases of the disease. So this suggests that we could create a world where Parkinson's is increasingly rare. But we really need to act. And we are beneficiaries of many actions of prior generations. Many of you realize that polio used to close down swimming pools and community centers until a March of Dimes raised money for it. 17 years after the March of Dimes was developed, Jonas Salk announced in Pittsburgh that he had developed a vaccine that works for the disease. Today, we live in a world largely free of polio. There are no polio associations of the Rockies. There are no polio treatment centers. There are no polio experts, at least in the United States. Polio is on the verge of becoming extinct. In 1980, a 13-year-old girl was walking and struck by a drunk driver, literally knocked out of her shoes and killed. The person who struck her was a drunk driver. In 1980, drinking and driving was legal in certain states in the country. Her mother, Candace Leitner, said it's the only socially acceptable form of homicide. 4 days after her daughter was killed, she begins lobbying a California legislator. Every day for a year, she went to Governor Jerry Brown's office and formed a group called Mothers Against Drunk Driving. 8 years after this accident, drinking and driving is illegal in all 50 states in the country. The blood alcohol level is dropped to 0.008, and the drinking age is raised from 18 to 21. Every year since 1988, 10,000 fewer children and adults are killed in drunk driving accidents because of the actions of Candace Leitner and her peers. 10,000 fewer deaths of children, 10,000 schools not torn apart, 10,000 communities not destroyed, 10,000 families not suffering because of the actions of an ordinary woman. In 1987, HIV is running rampant throughout the country. There's no federal response to the disease. Some doctors and hospitals refuse to care for people with the disease. Individuals are blamed for a disease that is killing them. In that setting, Larry Kramer and his colleagues formed an organization called ACT UP. ACT UP had a motto that silence equals death. And I think for the Parkinson's community, we've been silent for too long, and that's led to needless suffering. 8 years after Larry Kramer and his colleagues formed this organization, we had protease inhibitors, which have allowed for people with HIV to have a near normal life expectancy, which is not true of Parkinson's disease. It's allowed nearly 90% of people with the disease to be aware of their diagnosis, not true for Parkinson's disease. It's allowed 90% of people with aware of their diagnosis to be appropriately treated. Not true for Parkinson's disease. And it's allowed 90% of people who are being treated to have levels of the virus suppressed in their blood. These are all gifts that we've received from previous generations. Just like we have an obligation to receive gifts, we also have an obligation to reciprocate. And so I think the challenge to all of us here today is to create a world where Parkinson's disease is not increasingly common, but increasingly rare. And we can do that by eliminating the environmental causes of the disease in our environment. Paraquat's been around since the 1960s. Few of us would drive cars from the 1960s. Few of us would fly in an airplane from the 1960s. If engineers can come up with safer planes and safer cars, they can come up with safer chemists can come up with safer pesticides. The price of dry cleaning should not be Parkinson's disease. I think we can all agree on that. And we have demonstrated that we can dramatically reduce air pollution in our environment. We've done that. The skies over Los Angeles today are 50 to 90% cleaner than they were in the 1950s and 60s. That's with more people driving more cars, larger distances, and with the economy growing and larger than it has ever been before. The challenge for all of us here today is to take on the challenges that Candace Lightner did, that the March of Dimes did, that Larry Kramer did, and is create a world without Parkinson's disease. As a neurologist, I can't think of a greater gift to give future generations than that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dorsey. As you guys can tell, I was able to see Dr. Dorsey at World Parkinson's Congress and came back and immediately reached out to him to come talk here today, because I don't think we think about this as often as we should. And the whole goal is that we all need to go out and take action. So with that being said, we have time for questions. There are people who will be coming around with a microphone. Please do not ask your question until you have the microphone. Let's try to keep it not personal. I know everyone has a personal story that they want to share, but let's keep questions where they can apply to everybody. And we have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Doctor. What is the pesticide that's currently on the market that contains paraquat?
So the brand name of it is called Gramoxone. That's its brand name.
Thank you. Thank you.
I see questions out here in the front. Oh, thank you.
Are the slides or charts in your book?
Many of them are.
I have a question. A lot of the people in this room have a spouse with them who doesn't have Parkinson's, and I would assume that means that those of us who do, before we were married and were living together, were exposed to something different, or?
So there are some of the studies that the question is when both spouses have Parkinson's disease.
No, when one, what's the difference between the exposure of one spouse and the other if they live together and go to a lot of the same places together?
I think the exposure for Parkinson's disease, the most relevant exposure is childhood and young adult exposure. It might even be in utero exposure. Some of you guys know about the Brian Grant Foundation. So Brian Grant, former NBA basketball player, was a 3-year-old boy when he was at Camp Lejeune. His father dies of esophageal cancer linked to the chemical. His younger brother nearly dies while living at Camp Lejeune, miraculously gets better after they leave the base. And 30 years later, he develops Parkinson's disease. So I think for most people, the relevant exposure is what you were doing when you were a child. Did you grow up on a farm? Did you grow up when the pesticides were being sprayed above you?
Would you put your last slide up?
Yes, they'll help me. Yes, so if you have, by the way, yes, you all got copies. If you have questions or stories now, get to them, info@endingpd.org. You can email me anytime.
What role do you think genetics plays in Parkinson's.
So what role does genetics play? I think it plays a small role. I think it may explain why certain individuals exposed to a chemical, say paraquat, develop the disease while others do not. I think Dr. Paul's going to talk about this a little bit. We know that only 10% of smokers get lung cancer, so obviously there have to be other factors that determines who among the smokers develops the disease and who doesn't. I think that's role of exposure, dose, duration, timing, and route. I think there are genetic interactions so that we know that certain individuals metabolize these chemicals more efficiently or maybe at lower risk, and other people may metabolize these chemicals less well and therefore be at higher risk. We know that LART2, we know that GBA, I think Dr. Paul is going to talk about this, common genetic risk factor for Parkinson's, the most common genetic risk factor, has interactions with pesticides. So people who carry that genetic mutation might be at higher risk, more susceptible to the effects of these chemicals than people who don't. But just remember, almost everyone here doesn't carry it. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. Someone's going to tell me where. Oh, sorry. Yes, ma'am. Or yes, sir.
Hello. Does Guam have any known pesticides related to this?
Guam, and you're talking about Parkinson's and ALS at Guam.
Yeah.
Yeah. So next book we're writing right now, due to the publisher on Monday, called The Parkinson's Plan, 25 recommendations to help you lower your risk of Parkinson's and perhaps slow your rate of progression. We open up the chapter on food, on pesticides with the story of Guam. During World War II, Japan not only bombed Pearl Harbor, but they took over occupied Guam. The indigenous populations there were forced into labor camps and treated harshly. Many of them went away into the fields and relied on indigenous crops, including seeds from a plant called the cycad plant. And they ground up the seed into flour, and they knew that it was dangerous to do so, and under normal circumstances, they would wash it thoroughly, wash it over a series of 3 weeks, feed it to chickens and make sure that it was safe before making flour and tortillas out of it. It turns out that during this occupation, they didn't have that time, and it turned out that that seed, that flour, contained a naturally occurring chemical called BMAA. I told you that there's naturally occurring pesticides because plants don't like to be eaten by insects. Seeds don't like to be eaten by other animals either, so they have toxins. This toxin, BMAA, damages the energy-producing parts of cells and produces both ALS and Parkinson's disease. It turned out that not only did the indigenous population eat the seed and the flour, but they also ate the bats that ate the seed that would then concentrate the toxin in the fat of the bat. And they would eat the bat and would eat 100 times the concentration that they would eat in the seed and develop it. After the occupation ended, the bats disappeared because people started shooting them, and the disease miraculously disappeared. When you get rid of the exposure, you get rid of the disease. Yes, sir.
So you focused on 3 specific items, the paraquat, the TCE, and air pollution. Are those because you think those are just the most widespread influence and there are other things that also cause the disease, or why did you pick those 3 particular ones? And if we drive those down, what else will emerge?
Okay, so there are other pesticides. Paraquat's the one for which there's the most evidence. Are you going to talk about other pesticides? Dr. Paul's going to tell you about other pesticides, DDT and its other ones dissolve in fat. I think they're really important. TCE is just so widespread that I think it's the most important cause of disease in the United States. And air pollution levels in the United States are relatively low compared to other parts of the world, although highly variable. Some underserved communities have higher levels of air pollution and bigger risk factor than that. There are probably other chemicals, but I think those are the biggest ones. PCBs and things used in the electronics industry, heavy metals, others. I think Dr. Paul might even just touch on a few. But those are the big ones. Yes.
It seems to me that Roundup is the most commonly used pesticide in my neighborhood. What is the chemical in Roundup, and what's going on with Monsanto and trying to get Roundup off the market? Can you comment on that, please?
So the chemical in Roundup is called glyphosate. Dr. Paul knows more than I do. It appears not to be a major risk factor in Parkinson's. So all the chemicals that I've described to you, they have a few common characteristics. They're all inhaled or they're all ingested. They all damage the energy-producing parts of cells called the mitochondria. Many of you know that our brain is relatively small. It's only 2% of our body weight, yet it consumes 20% of our energy. And then nerve cells, neurons, consume 75% of that energy. And then among neurons, The most energy demanding of them are those among the most energy demanding are those dopamine producing nerve cells, which if you stretch them out are 4 meters in length. They have at least 1 million different connections, and they're not insulated, they're not myelinated, so they have huge energy demand. So I think if you look for toxins, pesticides, chemicals that are inhaled or ingested that damage the energy producing parts of nerve cells, those are the ones. And many of these pesticides, such as paraquat, have been demonstrated to reproduce the disease in animal models. So it's not all pesticides. Many pesticides probably have no relationship at all, perhaps most don't, to Parkinson's disease. It's just specific ones. Yes, I see lots of questions.
Hi.
Yes.
I'm an Air Force veteran, worked in aircraft maintenance my whole career. Trichloroethylene was a very common use during my entire career. So I have a two-part question. Does this symposium offer any help with VA claims? It's a challenging process. And the other is there any detoxification treatments that you say eliminate the cause, eliminate the disease? Is there anything that can detox your system?
Yes. So first of all, thank you very much for your service. I'll defer the VA one to the Parkinson's Association here. Obviously very concerning because Air Force mechanics, you can't come up with a higher risk factor, I think, for exposure to TCE than that. Can you detoxify it? There have been studies trying to lower levels of metals. It turns out that heavy metals are elevated in people with Parkinson's disease, I think, from air pollution. And there was a recent study in the New England Journal of Medicine that showed that a chelator that would take the metal out of the brain didn't work. It worked. It decreased the levels of metals, but not only was harmful, it made people worse. I don't think we know if there's ways to get it out. I think it's hard to do because I think the damage that has been done happened, for you probably 20, 30, 40 years ago. I think it's really important. By the time someone gets diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, many of you know that 60% of the nerve cells have already died. So you have these 40% remaining. I would protect them vigilantly. And so I would avoid chemicals. I would avoid, for example, using dry cleaners that use perchloroethylene. I avoid pesticides in all forms, not including food. I wash them on food in your garden, in your yard, what your neighbor's using. If you have a well water, I put a carbon filter on them. Exercise is probably our most effective intervention in terms of slowing the rate of Parkinson's disease. Exercise, as many of you know, releases growth factors that protect those nerve cells. So while you can't undo the damage, you can probably slow it by doing lots of things by protecting those remaining nerve cells that you have. I'll just say that stories are like yours. Every time I see one with Parkinson's disease, I get upset now. Exactly because of what you're experiencing, because I know that this is a preventable disease. That there's no reason that anyone should be suffering like you're suffering, like your wife's suffering, like your family's suffering. These diseases have causes. We need to find out what those causes are and eliminate them. They don't just happen by accident. Yes, sir.
I was wondering whether there has been any study correlating the efficiency of the supplements that contribute to the production of dopamine.
So there have been studies on supplements and Parkinson's. So there's one supplement called muconopurines. I don't know if that's what you're getting at. The muconopurines is from a velvet bean plant. It turns out that this velvet bean plant, widely prevalent in Southeast Asia, has levels of levodopa in it, and so it can be quite beneficial for people with the disease. There have been studies of other supplements like coenzyme Q10 in people with early Parkinson's disease, and they've shown not to be beneficial. So nothing has been shown yet, to my knowledge, in terms of supplements, besides muconopurines. Yes. Okay, yes, sir.
Would you
Go ahead.
encourage us to eat only organic foods?
So my wife used to tell me all this, especially when we had kids, and I poo-pooed it all. I used to think that the food we eat, the water we drink, and the air we breathe were safe. I no longer have that at all. At all. So I buy organic. I wash my organic produce with a a big bowl, and with a pesticide wash, you can get it like a vegetable wash, which is essentially just soap, and I wash all my produce. The Department of Agriculture, when it measures the residues on fruit, like apples, to determine whether it's safe, it does so after they've been under cold water for 15 to 20 seconds. So I did a 5-second pause, we'd still be washing it. So if that's what the Department of Agriculture is doing, think about what you should be doing. So yes. Foods are concentrated in animal products, so I told you about how the bat ate the seeds and concentrated it. Turns out that that cows eat grass or pineapple chop contaminated with pesticides concentrated in their milk, and then humans get it, and then they have higher rates of Parkinson's. Yeah.
Question.
Oh, sorry.
First of all, thank you. And with the increasing data that's showing a gut-brain health link and the foods we eat, and just a general observation, I don't know if most people are aware of it, but in the 60s, R.J.R. Reynolds was a tobacco producer. Today, they're one of the top food producers, and so is Philip Morris. And we're all more and more unhealthy, imagine that. But anyway, my point is that with the data coming out, do you have any information that would identify the benefits of healthy eating and its impact? And why is the medical industry largely ignorant to the fact that they're not looking at root causes?
Yeah, so when you guys were in school, how many obese children were in your class? There's maybe one, none, right? None. In 1990, 10% of Americans were obese. If you look at pictures from the 1960s, no one's obese. They're all thin. They're thinner than I am. So what's changed? Diet. I mean, who's putting soda into schools? We are. I mean, it is crazy that 40% of Americans are obese, 35% of adult Americans are obese. There are reasons for this. They are preventable, they are addressable. In our lifetime, obesity, we know, went from almost non-existent, rare, to almost the norm. I don't think that's right. And so there are studies that show that Mediterranean diet is beneficial for people with Parkinson's disease, and it may lower your risk of disease. Mediterranean diet is high in fruits and vegetables, low in animal products. Animals concentrate these toxic chemicals as they go up the food chain. I worry. I like cheese, and I worry about the cheese I buy because cheese is high in fat and it concentrates toxins, and I worry about that to this day. You know, the more you know, the more you see. Once you see it all around you, and you can't unsee it. And you need to take action. You have a responsibility, not an obligation, to create the world better, not only for your peers but for your children and for future generations. I think you just speak.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation and your book.
Thank you.
Very helpful. I'm just wondering if there's litigation, either through Parkinson's organizations or individuals, such as the gentleman who just spoke about 30 years being an airline mechanic. It seemed to, if not work, at least make more prevalent knowledge, and finally got rid of a lot of the pesticides ostensibly in Roundup and things like that. It certainly worked some on the smoking producers, the cigarette, even pipe smokers. So are there large class action suits, or is that just a thing of the past?
So I view lawsuits as occurring when we have failed to act as a community, and when our representatives have failed. And there are lawsuits, there are companies, there are individuals suing the manufacturers of Paraquat for their Parkinson's disease. A Marine named Jerry Insminger was a drill instructor at Camp Lejeune when his 6-year-old daughter, Janie, developed leukemia. Less than 3 years later, she died. He learned about the cancer-causing chemicals from a TV news broadcast, dropped his plate of spaghetti, and then realized it wasn't just his daughter that likely died from these chemicals, but it was all the Marines he had trained as a drill instructor. You know, the motto of the Marines is Semper Fi, always faithful, and he said that the role of a leader is to take accountability for the people that you are serving. And so after a 24-year career, and the retired Master Sergeant has launched a 27-year effort to bring justice for those Marines. And so there's the Camp Lejeune Justice Act, which was passed a year or two ago, that allows Marines who served between 1953 and 1987 to sue the federal government, normally immune from such suits. And so that's why you see all those ads on TV. I think when we're seeing these lawsuits, we're seeing a failure for us to come to grips and recognize that these chemicals are causing these diseases in our communities, and we need to tell our politicians and our representatives to do so. And we can act in our own community. Why are pesticides being sprayed on schools in Denver? Why is soda in our kids' schools? These are all things that we're allowing to do. These are reflections of our values and our commitments, and I think we've been ignorant for way, way, way too long and way too quiet. Yes, ma'am.
Well, you just answered my question. Why, in the face of all this incredible knowledge that the scientific community has given us, how come we haven't taken action to bring these people before Congress and talk about banning their...
So you're going to hear from Dr. Paul and Dr. Me and me, and most of our peers are unaware of this, I would say. There are reasons that we are ignorant. Mm-hmm. There are reasons we are ignorant. And I showed you why we're ignorant about paraquat. They had internal memos, according to reporting from The Guardian, that were concerned that pesticide study in Canada would lead us to conclude that pesticides were a causal factor in the disease. So they would publish papers, according to The Guardian, that would discredit the science. They prevented my colleague from serving on an EPA advisory committee because they thought she would be damaging. There are reasons that this is being done. You've taken the red pill or the blue pill, and you've been enlightened. And so we need to make our voices heard, just like the Mothers Against Drunk Driving did so.
That's what I was going to say, that when they started, they didn't know how many members of Congress there were. Is the Senate the one that has 100? I mean, they just started with very little knowledge about how to take civic action.
Exactly.
It seems to me that that's our next step.
I agree with you 100%.
And the scientific community has really given us a head start on how to take care of them.
And the people who changed this aren't scientists. So I showed polio. It wasn't neurologists who were leading the prize. Mothers Against Drunk Driving didn't start because of a trauma surgeon. Polio didn't start because of an infectious disease. It's because ordinary Americans, when confronted with it, took extraordinary actions and changed the course of history. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my question is, DDT at the time, is there a correlation between DDT and Parkinson's, even though it's not being used for over 50 years? And if so, it hasn't been used in over 50 years. Is there a reduction because it's not being used, or what?
Yeah, so there are studies linking DDT, and it belongs to a class of pesticides called organochlorines, which, chlorine, same to trichloroethylene, they're fat soluble, they get into the fat. And it turns out that a disease called dementia with Lewy bodies disease, some of you may know this disease is Parkinson's and dementia, it's the second most common cause of dementia in the world after Alzheimer's disease, wasn't described until 1976. And because I briefly mentioned that I think some pesticides are ingested in the beginning in the gut and they rise up. So this psychiatrist, Kenji Kosaka, he said, I got a person with Parkinson's and dementia, and I look at their brains and they got these Lewy bodies throughout their brain. I thought it might begin in the gut, so I went back and I said, well, what's going on in the food supply in Japan in 1976? It turns out that DDT levels in people's fat was obviously absent in the 1930s and 40s and then started rising in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, coinciding with this new illness being described, dementia with Lewy bodies. There are some parts of the world, like Europe, where Parkinson's is flattening or declining. They're among the areas of the world that have gotten rid of DDT and organochlorines at the earliest. Pesticide use globally is still rising. In Africa, which historically has not used pesticide use has tripled in the last just 30 years. 60% of the population there is in agriculture.
Two more questions, one there and one here.
Hi, the prevalence of Parkinson's is much higher in men than in women. And I'm wondering if the studies that are cited apply or have been done on women as well as men, and also if the progression of the disease or exposure is that much different for women than men. Thanks.
So there are some suggestions that biology might influence who develops Parkinson's disease and who doesn't. This appears to be true in laboratory animals. I think the differences between men and women are sociological, not biological. Indeed, most parts of the world, men are 40% increased risk than women, but in the United States, 75% of farmers are men, 97% of pesticide applicators are men, most mechanics are men. And in some parts of the world, women have the disease at equal rates to men, and in some cases they're even higher. Japan, Taiwan, and maybe South Korea. Dr. Paul might help me out a little bit. And they're the same. And I looked back, and it turned out, guess who did most of the farming in those communities? Women. So I think it's a reflection that sex differences, I think, are largely a reflection of sociology and not biology. Yes, sir.
Yes. What company makes paraquat? I know that's probably not a question you wanted to answer. And also, do they make TCE too, or?
The companies that make them are different. You can readily search that. I will just say that I'll say this. So I wrote a paper called Paraquat, Parkinson's Disease, and Agnotology. Guess who shows up at my doorstep, knocks on the door? My son answers the door because a law firm, a prestigious law firm representing the company, wanted to issue me a deposition looking for all the records that I had related to that paper. So you can imagine if someone knocked on your door, your teenage son answers the door because they're trying to serve a deposition, not a deposition, who's the lawyer in the room? Subpoena, thank you, to your father. If they're doing that to me, what are they doing to you? Thank you.